Now, with respect to this emergency wiretap, I also asked him, is there any OPP standard operating procedure or guideline with respect to emergency wiretaps? I'm not aware of it, but no doubt there is. You have no doubt there is? Yes. Would you undertake to make a phone call and make me aware of what the guidelines are? No, I will not. Read his cross-examination entirely and see if suppressing that evidence in particular was to protect Mr. Brant or to protect Mr. Fantino. Now, a third area of concern, and there are many areas of concern in the evidence of the preliminary inquiry. A third area of concern is about an undercover officer. There was an undercover officer named Steve Martell who testified that he attended the scene on June 29, the day of action, and posed as a media camera person while he did it. I asked him, are there any guidelines that are given to undercover officers as to what roles they may or may not pretend to play when they're undercover? Answer, we just don't engage in criminal activity, so as role-wise, there's no real guidelines. But isn't there a concern that if officers pretend to be media, that might interfere with freedom of the press in some sense? Have you ever heard any such concern? No. CBC, in wanting this information to become public in their factum, in other words, their legal document that they gave to the court in support of opening up this evidence to the public, they said, this is extremely troubling to CBC, given the potential for violence against media camera operators on the false assumption that they are agents of the police. And I would suggest it should be extremely troubling to members of the public as well, given our notions of freedom of the press, and no guidelines allowing the officer to pose as one of you guys. If you pose as an officer, that's an offense. If he poses as you, that is offensive, in my view, to values that we treasure. Those are some basic things. There are many, many other things in the transcripts here. There are many other things that are in progress. The way the OPP and the Crown have dealt with Shawn Brant is, in my view, especially post-Ipwash, quite surprising. And we will be pursuing that over the next months. But I would hope that in the short term, Mr. McGinty would be asked to really examine what he can learn about his commissioner of the OPP and consider whether or not there should be some further inquiry about that. And the public should make the Crown responsible for the extraordinary lengths that they went to and extraordinary public expense they went to try to suppress this evidence. Those are some of the basic facts. I could go on for a week, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Just for questions, would you be able to just remove your glasses? We're getting a little bit of
Okay.
Thanks.
That's one question I can answer.
All right.
Is there another question? An easy question.
No, in the transcripts of the wiretap conversation, Fantino was quoted as saying, your whole world, this is to Shawn Brant, your whole world is going to come crashing down. Pull the plug or you will suffer grave consequences. What do you make of those comments, and what is your reaction?
In my view, those comments are threatening Mr. Brant in a way that's entirely inappropriate, not likely to lead to any positive resolution, totally counter to both the spirit and letter of the Ipwash recommendations. And I should point out, there was a question in Chief Fantino's mind as to whether or not there was a broken promise to Mr. Brant with respect to the April blockade. It seems clear on the evidence, but there is some debate about it, that Shawn Brant was offered immunity from criminal activity if the April blockade of CN Rail was ceased. It did cease, and he was charged, and he's still facing those charges. In the course of his conversation with Commissioner Fantino on this occasion, he explained to Commissioner Fantino that the people here, he said, and he explained over and over in the course of that conversation to Commissioner Fantino, that he is operating on a consensus basis with the other people who are part of this occupation of the rail of the 401 at the time. And he explained to the commissioner, I have to go check with the people, we have to talk about it. And at one point he told Commissioner Fantino, as you'll see, if you read the transcript of Fantino's evidence, he told him, people are saying to me, how can we trust Commissioner Fantino because of the broken promise of immunity a couple months ago? And Fantino doesn't engage him in that discussion. As you look at the transcript, I say to him, shouldn't you have dealt with that? Shouldn't you have said sorry if there was a misunderstanding? Fantino's position is there wasn't really an offer. Okay. But when Mr. Brant tells you, when you're trying to negotiate something, that people are saying they broke their promises in April, how can we believe them now? You have to respond to that if you respect that person as a human being. You have to say something like, at least, well, there might have been a misunderstanding there. I'm sorry for any such misunderstanding. Let's try and rebuild the trust, something like that. I asked Fantino, don't you think in retrospect at least you should have done that? Or something, I forget exactly what I said, something to that effect. And he said, no, I stand by what I said. Chief Fantino appears to be a law and order kind of guy. He had that reputation when he was chief of the Toronto Police Force, chief of the London Police Force, and so on. In my submission, when you look at the transcript of what he said at the preliminary inquiry, you come to the conclusion that his attitude is not consistent with the requirements post-divorce.
So what do you think should be, you're asking the Premier to read the transcript, you're asking the Attorney General to look at it. What do you think should happen to Commissioner Fantino in light of these, you say he's threatened your client? What do you think the government and the Premier should do about it?
I think they should immediately dismiss, put on hold, suspend pending an investigation. I don't think anybody should be dismissed without an investigation, but they should suspend Commissioner Fantino as commissioner. You know what's very unfortunate? A couple months ago, Commissioner Fantino was renewed after this evidence was already there, but while it was being suppressed by the Crown. And we couldn't talk about it at that time. It would have been very appropriate, with part of the public discussion at that time, as to whether or not he should be renewed. There should have been this evidence in front of the public so they can consider it.
Can you clarify that? Do you mind repeating what you said in terms of what they should do?
Well, in my view, what should be done right now is Premier McGuinty should direct some people within his government to seriously consider what Commissioner Fantino said under oath at the preliminary inquiry as posted on the CBC website, and then consider whether or not it's appropriate for Mr. Fantino to remain commissioner of the OPP. You know, the OPP does almost all the policing of Aboriginal protests in this province, because such protests don't usually occur in the municipalities that have their own police forces, like Toronto and so on. So this is very crucial. A man was killed in 1995 by an OPP sniper. Commissioner Fantino admitted that there were snipers there. Read the transcript. There were snipers ready at this time, and he was close to moving in. Somebody could have gotten killed. Luckily, in my view, because of the restraint shown by the protesters, nobody was killed or injured. But this kind of attitude is going to lead again to another hip wash. Or it has at least a high probability of doing so, given the number of such protests that take place. So in my view, it's urgent that the government seriously look at this. I understand that Mr. McGuinty has expressed his support for Commissioner Fantino. I wonder if that support would survive the scrutiny of his evidence here. And Michael Bryant, as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, is in a special, and former Attorney General and a lawyer, is in an especially well-placed position to consider this. He is very familiar with their wash and the recommendations, and I would request of Mr. Bryant that he examine that transcript and consider whether or not he should recommend to the government that at least an investigation should be undertaken as to whether or not it's suitable to have Commissioner Fantino remain in his post.